You are performing this repair at your own risk. We cannot be held responsible for any injuries to yourself or damage done to your device while attempting a repair. In this video, we'll be demonstrating how to replace a front screen assembly on the iPhone 4 CDMA version, which would be either Sprint or Verizon for the carrier. If you have AT&T or T-Mobile, you have the GSM version. Please see our channel for a video on how to replace that screen. Here's a look at our replacement screen, which is a full screen assembly. Be sure you purchase a full assembly because you cannot separate these pieces. This includes a front glass, the touch-sensitive digitizer, as well as the display. One cable goes to the touchscreen, and one goes to the LCD. Our first step will be to power off the device. Our next step will be to remove two pentalobe screws on opposite sides of the sync port. There's no substitute for the pentalobe screwdriver. You can find all parts and tools required for this repair on our website, gadgetmenders.com. Now we can slide the back cover up about 1/4 inch, which will slide it out from underneath the tabs on the phone and allow us to remove it. Our next step is to remove the battery. However, first we have to remove the small Phillips screw shown here, which will allow us to unplug the battery connector. With that screw removed, we can take our non-conductive pry tool and wedge it carefully in between the battery cable and the port on the logic board. Gently lift upward and it should unplug no problem. If you apply too much force, you can damage the battery connector on the logic board or break it off completely, which is not repairable. Now this plastic tab extends underneath the battery and was meant to allow you to lift it out. However, the adhesive holding the battery in place is very strong, so you'll need to pry the battery out. Avoid prying near the top of the battery where cables run beneath. Now we'll turn our attention towards the top portion of the phone, where we have a metal plate that needs to be removed. There are a total of 5 screws holding this metal plate in place. They're all Phillips screws, and they can all be removed using your small Phillips screwdriver. Now as we continue removing the various parts of the phone, we'll have a number of screws. They're not all the same size, so as you set the parts to the side, be sure to position the screws near the areas where they came from, so you'll have a reference when you go to put the phone back together. Now this metal cover has a black tab that extends underneath of the board, so we can't just lift it out of there. We have to slide it inwards towards where the battery is located, but not too much because you can see that there's a black cable that runs along the inside, and we don't want to damage that cable. Once we've slid it out from underneath the board, we can lift that metal plate out. Also, you want to make note of the 2 metal extensions on this piece that slide in inlets in the black square on the board. Next, we'll be unplugging the cables that we've uncovered. First will be the 2 screen cables. We'll use our non-conductive plastic pry tool to gently pry upwards and unplug these from their ports on the logic board. The first cable powers the digitizer or touch-sensitive part of the screen, and the second cable powers the display or LCD. At this point in the process, it's a good idea to plug the screen in from the back and give it a quick test. This will ensure that we don't go through the entire process with a defective screen and have to do it all over again. So we'll plug the battery back in and take our replacement screen and plug it in from the top as shown. Now keep the phone positioned just how it is, because we don't want to risk tearing the screen cables, and use a plastic tool or something similar to engage the power button and turn on the device. Here we want to make sure that the LCD, the display, is clear, there's no dead pixels or broken lines, and we also want to verify that the touchscreen is working properly. Here we can already see that the display is good. Now once the phone boots up, we'll be able to test the touchscreen. Now you can see that the brightness went out, and that's because the auto brightness is detecting no light since the phone is facing down. So the light sensor is on the front side of the phone, so if we lift the phone up slightly, the brightness will come back. And we can verify that the touch and display are working properly and move forward. Continuing on, we have 3 more cables that will need to be unplugged from the logic board. When unplugging cables from the logic board, remember to pry up gently using your plastic non-conductive pry tool. You don't want to risk damaging the connectors, and you also don't want to end up tearing any of the cables. If you tear the cables, you can replace them. However, if you damage the logic board ports, that's not repairable, and you'll need to replace the board, which doesn't make sense due to cost. Next, we'll remove the small Phillips screw as shown here. Now we'll go ahead and lift out this black metal piece. And we've uncovered yet another cable that will need to be unplugged. Next, we'll move over to this area, and we have two screws that are holding a metal plate over another cable. And then we'll go ahead and unplug this cable. With the cable unplugged, we can peel it back as there's an adhesive underneath the cable. So we'll carefully peel it back, and once we reach the bottom of the phone, it's going to curve, so we'll have to peel it towards the side of the phone so that we don't tear the cable. Next, we have another small Phillips screw to remove, which is holding in place an antenna cover. We'll remove this screw and set the antenna cover aside. We'll now go ahead and gently unplug the antenna cable. Now go ahead and remove the small Phillips screw being shown here. Here we'll point out two more Phillips screws that are going to need to be removed. This small black grommet goes underneath of the screw. Be sure to set that aside for reassembly. We can now go ahead and lift out this black assembly at the bottom, which includes a speaker and antenna. Back up to the top portion of the phone, we'll go ahead and unplug the rear facing camera, which will allow us to lift it out. Now there's a hidden screw that will need to be removed. It's beneath this tape, so what we'll do is puncture the tape and use our Phillips screwdriver to unscrew it. This screw also holds in a metal piece that we'll remove along with the screw. We now have 3 remaining second layer screws. They're being pointed out here in the video, and we'll use our small flathead screwdriver to remove these. We can now lift the logic board out as shown in the video. We'll lift it at an angle towards the top, as there's a notch that extends from the board and goes in an inlet in the metal frame. Make sure that it doesn't get snagged on any cables, and if you find that the board does not want to come free, chances are there's probably another screw that needs to be removed, perhaps the hidden screw near the camera. Here's a quick glance at how we have the parts and screws organized off to the side. Our next step is to pry out the vibrate module, which is held on with a light adhesive. We now have 10 screws that are holding the screen on. 4 of these 10 screws will be removed completely, while the 3 just pointed out are 3 of 6 that will be just loosened. The 4 corner screws are the ones that will be removed completely, while the 6 side screws will just be loosened, about 2 full turns. The screw mounts on the side do not make a full circle. Thus, we can save time by not removing them completely and still being able to remove the screen. So we'll loosen each of the side screws about 2 to 2.5 turns. If they fall out, it's okay. Just note that there is a washer that sits in between the screw and the frame. The corner screw in the top left is hidden beneath black tape. Similar to the first hidden screw we encountered, we'll puncture the tape and unscrew that Phillips head. With those 10 screws taken care of, we can begin to pry the screen away from the metal frame. There's a double-sided tape at the top and bottom portions behind the screen that are still holding it intact. Try to keep your pry tool wedged around the outer perimeter and not so far on the inside so that you don't damage the home button at the bottom or the proximity sensor, speaker, or front camera at the top. Note that the home button is separate from the screen and will remain attached to the phone as we remove the screen. Because the screen cables are attached to the top portion, it's easier to pry at the bottom first and make your way towards the top. When the screen is completely free from the adhesive, we can open it at an angle from the bottom towards the top, and we can then feed the screen cables through their opening in the metal frame and remove the screen entirely. Next, we'll go ahead and remove the double-sided adhesive from the top and bottom portions. Broken glass shards tend to stick to this adhesive, and they can cause issues when you go to install your replacement screen. Since we have screws that are holding the screen in place anyway, the adhesive isn't necessary. Next, we'll grab our replacement screen. Now note that the replacements do not include a dust mesh over the earpiece opening on the back side. So you either have to transfer your old one or purchase a brand new one and install it. Be sure to peel off the plastic protector over the back side of the LCD. When feeding the cables through the opening in the metal frame, be 100% certain that this lower loop of the longer cable is fed all the way through. It tends to get caught on the frame, and when this happens and you go to plug the cables into the board, the cable will appear to be too short, and if you pull on it, it'll rip right off of the screen. Now watch here as we carefully feed the cables through the opening. We'll start by setting the top portion of the screen flush and working our way toward the bottom. In this case, the screen went flush without any issues. However, you may find that the screw mounts on the sides will tend to get caught up against the screws that we didn't remove completely. You can take a small flathead and make minor adjustments to the frame or the washer in between the side screw, and this should allow the frame to sit flush. You should not have to push hard on the screen in order to get it flush. If you find yourself doing this, stop immediately because you could damage the screen. Chances are the frame is caught somewhere, or there may be something in between the screen and the frame. With the screen flush on all sides, begin to tighten the screws on the sides before reinserting the screws along the four corners. Next, form the cables so that they'll be able to wrap around the board by bending them as shown in the video. Next, we'll stick the vibrate module back in place, and we can use the original adhesive that's still on the back side of the vibrate module. Try to line it up as best as possible, however it doesn't have to be perfect, just be sure that the screw hole lines up with the mount. We'll now reinstall the board, and remember the notch at the top of the board that sits in an inlet in the metal frame. If you find yourself with a stray black rubber piece, you should reinstall it at the top of the logic board as shown. Be sure that this is in place before you go to install the board. When you're installing the board, be sure that none of the plugs end up underneath. So we'll first insert that notch in the inlet and fold the board down. The board will stay flush at the top due to the notch and inlet. However, you should hold it down at the bottom using your finger and immediately install the screws shown here. Our next step will be to install the gold metal piece near the camera that was hidden beneath the tape, and follow up by reinstalling the associated Phillips screw. We'll next install the rear-facing camera, so first reinsert it into its opening, and then gently press down on the cable so that it snaps back into place on the logic board. If you find yourself having to press extremely hard, chances are you'll have to make some minor adjustments because it's not positioned correctly over the port, and you risk damaging the connector. Keep this in mind when plugging in the remainder of the cables. Our next step will be to reinstall the 3 second layer screws that require a small flathead. Next, we'll install the speaker and antenna piece, and note these metal prongs that stick out. These will need to tuck on the inside of this metal frame. Next, reinstall the 2 associated Phillips screws, as well as a black piece that goes on the opposite side near the vibrate module. Next, wind the antenna cable back in place and carefully plug it back into its port. Next, we'll position the antenna cover as shown and reinstall the associated Phillips screw. Next, position the long cable back in place and snap it back into its port on the logic board. Next, reinstall the plug's cover as well as the 2 associated Phillips screws. Next, we'll very gently plug in the 3 cables shown here. Next, we'll go ahead and plug the 2 screen cables in, starting with the LCD cable shown here. The second cable leads to the digitizer or touch-sensitive part of the display. If this cable appears to be too short at this time, you'll need to take the entire phone back apart and reinsert the cables through the opening in the frame. Do not pull it through and try to make it longer because it will tear the cable. Next, plug in the final antenna cable at the top as shown. Now go ahead and put the metal antenna cover back in place. Next, install the antenna cover's associated Phillips screw. Now we'll go ahead and install the metal cover that prevents the cables from coming unplugged. Be sure that the areas shown are tucked in properly. Once the cover is correctly in place, go ahead and reinstall the 5 associated Phillips screws. We'll now go ahead and reinstall the battery. Be sure that it does not catch and flatten the cables that run along the sides in the areas shown. We'll now go ahead and plug the battery cable back into its port. You should not have to press too hard. If you find yourself having to press hard, readjust the cable because you could risk damaging the port. And of course our next step will be to reinstall the associated Phillips screw. Now we'll grab the back cover and you can see these locking tabs that will slide underneath divots inside the phone. We'll place the cover so that it sits about 1/4 inch above the top of the phone and then slide it down so that these tabs lock into place. Be sure that the back cover is flush on all sides of the phone before sliding it down. We can then go ahead and reinstall the 2 final screws using our Penelope screwdriver. Finally, we'll power on the phone and ensure that everything is working just the way it was before we replaced our cracked screen. We'll want to test the home button, touch screen, LCD, side volume buttons, mute button, power button, earpiece, Wi-Fi antenna, cellular service, everything. Here's a list of common issues that are encountered following the screen replacement, as well as some possible fixes. If the screen was damaged during the install, you will need a new screen. Hopefully you found this tutorial to be helpful. Show your support by ordering from our website, gadgetmenders.com, where you'll find all the parts and tools required for this repair.